Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Garfinkel Menard Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Commonwealth Fund, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Hefner, your host on The Open Mind. And the other evening, preparing for this program, I was looking through my now more than half-century-old paperback copy of Coming of Age in Samoa, the innovative and ultimately controversial study of adolescence and sex in primitive society that had first drawn our attention to Margaret Mead, the now world-renowned cultural anthropologist whose centennial we celebrate in 2001. And to mark that occasion, with me here today is Dr. Mead's daughter, herself an accomplished anthropologist, Dr. Mary Catherine Bateson, who has joined me before on The Open Mind, first in the 1980s to discuss With a Daughter's Eye, that wonderfully evocative volume in which she shared with us so much of both of her famous parents, Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson, also a most accomplished anthropologist. Later, too, Mary Catherine Bateson talked with us here about other of her compelling studies, such as Composing Our Lives and Full Circles, Overlapping Lives. But now I would like Dr. Bateson to discuss the Margaret Mead Centennial, though not before I describe her mother once more as perhaps the most giving person I've met at this table since I began The Open Mind in 1956. Margaret Mead graced this program many times, alone and, as was our custom earlier on, with others too. Always she was enormously generous to me and to my family. Indeed, when my wife wrote Mothering, the Emotional Experience of Motherhood After Freud and Feminism, Dr. Mead devoted her precious time, even in her very last days, to write a most perceptive and helpful comment about the book. In fact, I think Dr. Mead just never said no to any appropriate request, professional or personal. And I particularly remember how she delighted my two young sons with her charming eccentricities. In thought and in deed, she always made me aware of graciousness and wisdom that were endless and, in their way, seamless. Yet I certainly wasn't a personal friend, nor part really of her own vastly extended family. And I don't claim Margaret Mead as a friend, as so many obviously did and do, who, as her daughter has written, never met her but had read her writings or heard her recorded voice or viewed her image on a screen, as here on The Open Mind. But now we celebrate her centennial in 2001. And I want to begin this first centennial program about Margaret Mead by asking her daughter not only what were the major contributions her mother made to our understanding of ourselves and of our culture here in the 21st century, but also just how will the Mead Centennial be celebrated. So, there you are.
Well, you know, you warned me you were going to ask this. And one of the things that I immediately realized is that much of what my mother did that was radically new in her time has become part of our common sense. That she was at the frontier of bringing to the American public the concept of culture, the notion that societies in other places and times not only have different customs, but see the world differently, think differently about the world, and that this is an extraordinary evidence of the flexibility and potential of human beings, that we are not locked in by our past. And through her studies of specific groups of people, and then going on to comment on questions as they arose in the context of American culture, I think she introduced a note of, first of all, of openness and curiosity, but then a sense of possibility that hadn't previously existed. Now, that said, so much that she wrote about childhood, about adolescence, about gender, has come to be taken largely for granted. You know, when my mother decided that I was to be breastfed on a self-demand pattern, I was the first breastfed self-demand baby that Benjamin Spock ever saw. Because in those days, educated middle-class women were all committed to high-tech nursing, or what the equivalent thereof. But now it's taken for granted, at least as an option, by mothers everywhere. And so part of what her legacy has become so close to us. I, for instance, have great difficulty sometimes saying, did I learn this from her or did I figure it out from myself? But there are other things in her legacy that have not been sufficiently integrated in our thinking.
Like what?
Well, you see, we have become an increasingly compartmentalized society. Specialist in this, expert in that. And one of the things that she represented, because she was an anthropologist who studied small communities that perhaps had never been studied before, so she wanted to get the whole picture. So instead of the situation we have, where we have all these different departments and experts, she wrote with an awareness that politics and child-rearing and religion and economics and how houses are built and how people are buried are all interconnected, that cultures are integrated. So that was one thing that I hoped we would re-emphasize through the Centennial, is go back to thinking of a very complex pattern of integration. You know, something very sad has happened over the last few years, that globalization, which I thought when I first heard the term had to do with the sense of being part of a worldwide community, being open to cultures everywhere. It's come to mean an economic process. And so often we focus in on the economy, stupid, instead of saying, well, what is the whole shape of people's lives?
Now, this anthropological approach was new, I gather, at the beginning of the century when your mother was born, was even somewhat new when, as a young woman, she went to Samoa. Is that correct? I know there was a great teacher, Franz Boas.
Certainly Boas and Ruth Benedict.
Mm-hmm.
I think Boas, well, Benedict took the concept of the way a culture is integrated a substantial step further by what the notion that culture is personality writ large. As time went on, my mother also saw the contrasts within a given culture and how that works. And anthropology has moved on in her lifetime towards seeing conflict as well as congruity within a culture.
But you know, you spoke about flexibility and possibility. And I remember that it was Max Lerner, actually, who identified himself at this table as a possibilist, but I always thought that about your mother, too. But there are those who think in terms of cultural determinism. And how do you, as an anthropologist, how did she manage to emphasize change and flexibility with an understanding, going along with an understanding of cultural determinism?
Well, I wish that every youngster growing up in America could have an intensive experience of another culture. Because I think this is one of the ways we learn to do what's now called thinking out of the box. That is, looking at a question without being constrained, without being determined by what people have taken for granted before. And I mean, she had an extraordinary upbringing, a very interesting family life and education, as of course I did with these parents of mine. But really, I think what she brought to every topic of public debate was a willingness to question things that are taken for granted. Is warfare a part of every human society? No, it's not. Is adolescent turmoil a part of every human society? It's a potential of every society for biological reasons, but depending on how adolescents are treated, the development is different.
Was that the great message of growing up in Samoa?
Coming of age in Samoa?
Coming of age in Samoa.
It really was. That the things we had come to take for granted about adolescence did not necessarily occur in every society. In every society, you have to deal with the fact that your body is changing and new hormones are surging up, and there's a tendency to want to test boundaries and so on. But depending on how the boundaries are constructed, it can be a time of huge conflict or a time of great learning. And we've made, I think, improvements in the way we deal with adolescence. They're always a little tenuous, but I think the awareness that conflict between young and old is not a necessary fact of those years has been helpful.
Now, you've written about, you've spoken about, and we've spoken about here the opposition of an anthropological approach and a biological approach. Where is destiny?
Well, biology is where destiny starts, of course. I mean, we can only learn and adapt and change because we have the biology appropriate for learning and adapting and changing. Okay?
Okay.
And we have evolved to be not only the learning species, but the teaching species. Par excellence, the discovering species. Instead of adapting by some rather rigid pattern of behavior, as very many species have, a pattern of behavior that fits them perfectly to a particular niche and is hard programmed, we have adapted, and that's our biology, by being flexible.
So flexibility is biology.
Flexibility is a part of biology, a part of our biology. And therefore, in a real sense, as a species, we have the possibility of making our destiny. Now, that doesn't mean that every individual makes all of his or her choices in perfect freedom. we choose in the context of what we are able to imagine. And we now live in a time where, partly because of cross-cultural knowledge, we are able to imagine far more alternatives than ever before. We are able to imagine a world without war. We are able to imagine a world in which males and females are equals. We are able to imagine a world in which every child develops to his or her best potential. And once we imagine it, we can get to work and try to build it.
Why was it the 1920s in which we found the ideas expressed in Coming of Age in Samoa and in other Margaret Mead writings? Why was it then? Was it the power of your mother? Was it the power of Margaret Mead? Or were we at a stage in our own cultural development?
Oh, I think it's where we were in our own cultural development. And this, you know, something that she felt very strongly is that although you can trace key ideas to particular brilliant individuals, an idea has an impact on a society because it's taken up by other people and it interacts with other ideas. I think, well, as I said before, in many ways, she was just enough ahead of her time so that people would hear her speak and they'd say, wow, it never occurred to me that way. And then a month later, they'd think they'd always known it. And that was what made her such a skilled communicator.
You know, it's interesting. I came across in one of my readings in the past week this reference to Margaret Mead, this comparison of her to Eleanor Roosevelt. And then I thought back to the 30s and to the 40s and realized, by gosh, that's true. You think of two major women in those years, and one was certainly Eleanor Roosevelt, and the other, perforce, was Margaret Mead. An incredible impact that she had at that time. If Dr. Mead had been able to survive through the Centennial, do you think she would have been aware of progress? Do you think she would have been disappointed that we hadn't, in terms of her own pioneering work, sufficiently moved forward?
Oh, I think both. She was, I believe, a congenital optimist. She worried about things, and she was critical of things, and she was impatient with things. But at the deepest level, I think she was optimistic about human beings and optimistic about American society. And so there are many trends that continue that she would have criticized. There have been so many things that she hoped would advance and haven't advanced as far as they might have. There are technological breakthroughs that she would have adored. She would have adored the internet. I'm really sad that she missed out on that.
I remember hearing her say at a meeting that I presided at, she was filled with enthusiasm about this new instrument, television. And she said that it meant that in the future, they, the forces, the bosses, could never again pull the wool over our eyes because the camera's eye would be there to reveal what they were doing. Now, I happen to think that was a terribly optimistic, overly optimistic and naive point of view, but I do remember her great enthusiasm, feeling this was going to be the solution of many, many problems.
Well, I think she was probably commenting, two great examples where this is at least partly true. One was the McCarthy hearings, where when the American public saw McCarthy on television, they realized that they did not trust him and that this was a put-up job. The other has been Vietnam, that at the point where the actual battle scenes came into people's living rooms, popular attitudes, new kinds of attitudes towards a war began to develop. Now, of course, there are clever people, there are spin doctors and so on, who are steadily learning how to manipulate television more and more effectively. And I hope very much that the internet will remain a very free area of expression. I think cable has opened up television in new ways, so it is not monopolized by just a few networks. It's funny about progress. I usually don't like to use the word because you have what looks like a step forward, and there are a new set of problems buried inside it. And I think that's how it is. And I think she was the kind of person who saw the donut before she saw the hole.
Let me ask you a question that has been to me a source of puzzlement. And I wanted to ask you, those of you who are marking the Margaret Mead Centennial in 2001 say again and again, quote again and again, that expression, never a doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Is that some kind of coda?
When I first started thinking about the Centennial, the question that I struggled with was this question of how do you deal with someone who was involved with so many issues? How do you focus the Centennial? And I knew I wanted it to be focused on the future, not on the past. Janetta Cole, who was president of Spelman College at that time, saw that slogan on the wall of a Patagonia store and suggested building the Centennial about that. Because I don't want the Centennial to be something that I'm organizing or the Institute for Intercultural Studies is organizing. Our concept is that a lot of people to whom Mead's words on some topic have been important, who are working on issues now, trying to change the world and the future as we approach it, would be able to work on their issues and tie them in to this larger vision. So I wanted a very open-ended statement, and that's really what I've been hoping for. I mean, there are some big celebrations coming up, but what to me is the real expression of the Mead Centennial in the months ahead, in this whole year 2001, is that small groups of people have the imagination, don't feel dwarfed by all that's going around them, but say, in fact, they can change the world. That's what we're celebrating, really.
The basic element of Margaret Mead, we can change the world.
We have changed it. The question is, we can choose the way in which we change it. And the way we choose as a society is by being able to talk and discuss and expose ourselves to the new ideas.
Do you think that was the most basic contribution, that singular thought?
No, I put it out there because I felt it was a way of focusing now in 2001. That saying came out of her experience in 1953 when she went back to the South Pacific for the first time after World War II and studied a group of people who, when she first studied them, still had a Stone Age technology and had had very little contact with the outside world, the Manus people of the Admiralty Islands. And what they had done after a lot of disruptions during the war of their ancient tradition was to say, all right, now we can decide what culture we want to have. She was tremendously excited by that. New lives for old. We can choose our future.
I think, you know, it is at that point that I need to say to you, you must come back again and speak more about the Mead Centennial itself and the elements that will go into it, and maybe sometime in the near future you'll do that. Meanwhile, thank you so much for joining me again today.
It's always a pleasure.
Thanks, Dr. Bateson. And thanks, too, to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And if you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind, P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York 10150. And I think we ought to get a website.
There is a Mead Centennial website, www.mead2001.org, with lots more information on it.
Great. Meanwhile, as an old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Garfinkel Menard Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Commonwealth Fund, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Garfinkel Menard Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Commonwealth Fund, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America. I'm Richard Hefner, your host on The Open Mind, and this is the second of our programs celebrating in 2001 the centennial of Margaret Mead, the 20th century's most truly world-renowned cultural anthropologist. My guest, Dr. Mead's daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, is herself an anthropologist. And I would like to ask you, Dr. Bateson, first, when you wrote Full Circles, Overlapping Lives, you dedicated your book to the memory of your mother, Margaret Mead, 1901-1978, for her pioneering work on the relationship between culture and generation. And what did you mean by that expression?
She wrote a book during the 60s, about the 60s, when people were talking about the generation gap and youth revolution and so on and so forth, with the title Culture and Commitment. And in it she explored the various multiple different patterns of relationship between generations. The pattern that you get when all young people expect to be just like their parents. That's how their lives will be in a very stable culture. The pattern that you get in a society with a large number of immigrants, where for immigrants, the children teach the parents. And the pattern that you get in a society of very rapid change, where all the elders depend on learning their way into the future from those who are younger than them. And that's one of the things I talk about in Full Circles. And it's more true now than ever before.
Why?
Well, just an immediate example is when your children teach you how to work the VCR. When your grandchildren teach you how to use email. But what interests me about that, and I think is implicit in what she was saying, is that when the young start being listened to in some areas, they begin to be listened to more in other areas. And today, as we, for instance, become more sensitive to environmental issues, who teaches the older people how to recycle? Very often their children. Or we deal with all the equal rights and liberation movements that have happened in this country in the last half century. And very often, it's 12-year-olds who say to their parents, who hear the residues of one form of bigotry or another that their parents grew up with, and say, I don't like to hear you talk like that. So that increasingly, our children become guides in working with emerging ethical insights in the society.
Is this a function of the 20th and 21st centuries, or is this true historically?
I think it is a function of our time, that the speed of technological change and associated social change means that you and I, Dick, are immigrants. We're immigrants to the present from the past. And we need to learn to live skillfully and intelligently in this time.
But you know, this insight, I'm puzzled. This insight to which you give expression, and which your mother gave expression to, her work was done in Samoa and in other communities so far from us. Could that possibly have been true there too? Or was she, when she wrote about generation, really speaking more about our country, our civilization, and didn't derive that from her experience with a native population? You're talking about immigrants.
I think she derived the sense that there are different ways of handling intergenerational relations from her fieldwork. On the one hand, societies like Samoa that were very relaxed in the way they dealt with teenagers, as opposed to societies that were very coercive and puritanical, so that she could see multiple patterns. it was not a novel insight to realize that sometimes there is conflict between generations. A lot of people just saw the 60s that way. I think the novel insight she brought to it was really to say that the conversation between generations has been permanently changed by the fact that we now live surrounded by change of many kinds. Now, we're not expressing it in the same kind of dramatic ways that came out in the 60s. And to some degree, she felt that this was a one-time only event.
Indeed.
The generation gap. Well, it was a one-time only gap in this event in the sense that you shift gears, but we're in a different gear now.
You think permanently? You couldn't believe that. We must be going on to another gear and another gear and another gear.
You know what? I don't think there will ever again be a time when all adults can say to all young people, I always know better than you because I'm older.
Why will that be? Why will there never be another time? Because we're constantly in transition now, because change takes place so...
I think change is self-reinforcing. I think we have, if you like, institutionalized change. If you just think about the economic world, the realization that you can't simply go on manufacturing the same product or adding a few bells and whistles to make it look new, but that you have to be rethinking what you're doing, really is pervasive.
Talking about pervasive, I am switching subjects here because I really do want to talk about the Centennial. Mm-hmm. I do want to talk about what it is in 2001 that you and your associates will be doing to mark the Mead Centennial.
Well,
a few of the things.
First of all, my thought about this whole year has been that other people would be doing it. The special sessions at the American Anthropological Association, the exhibit at the Library of Congress, a lot of events on different campuses discussing the nature of the public intellectual or education in America, or there's so many different themes that have been picked up. But I've always felt that the real celebration of the Centennial would be when someone walks into a school committee meeting in a small town, somewhere in the heartland of America, and says, you know, if we're educating our children for the future, we have to teach them how to learn, not have them memorize things. We have to help them adapt. We have to make them open-minded and flexible rather than giving them multiple choice questions. That to me is what it's about.
Now, you say that to you is what it is about, but as you look around us, as we enter 2001, are you disappointed in your hope that this is what will happen? Can you possibly be sanguine about that small town?
I think it's something that keeps happening in small towns around America, and in cities and neighborhoods. It doesn't happen enough. One of the most interesting things is what ideas get emulated and spread out through the country. I was concerned that the year 2000, there would be so much emphasis on high tech and globalization that people would feel helpless. One of my thoughts was that the Mead Centennial 2001 would be Alka-Seltzer for the millennial hangover, a time when people would feel that what they say and do makes a difference. That's not easy in our society today. And I don't think that the conviction that what you do makes a difference is served by a lot of argument about the stature of somebody who's been dead for many years. I think we draw on figures from our past to empower ourselves to act for the future.
But models are necessary.
Models are necessary.
And when you use the expression before, public intellectual, I thought to myself, that is the way I thought of Margaret Mead, the public intellectual. What's happened to that concept in our own times?
I think it's still definitely around. I think there are
alive, but how well?
Well, I'd hate to have to grade it, but then again, I don't like grading papers. It's blurred because there are so many voices. Unfortunately, because what was originally a lot of talk and conversation television has been degraded. I think you are one of the people that keeps really good conversation alive with the people you invite onto this show.
But the people have to be there. The public intellectual has to be there. The person who is willing to step outside of the academy. The person who, like your mother, was always so willing to go on, not just talk shows, not just little talk shows like mine, but to appear in much larger entertainments. She saw a role for herself. Now, do you find that happening anywhere like to the degree that she represented the public intellectual?
See, one of the things that I have felt about this, Dick, is that she was, in many ways, the only public voice of anthropology for a long time. And a lot of people got in the habit of sitting on their duffs and being sarcastic about her, but not being willing to stand up and speak to the general public. And that in the present, what we need is not one or half a dozen voices. We need a spectrum of voices. In other words, the public intellectual is a kind of lonely, embattered, heroic figure, like Mencken, is not what we need now. What we need, much as the media might like to focus on one or two individuals, what we need is to improve the quality of public conversation at every level.
Will there be elements of the Centennial celebration that will do that?
I'm hoping there will. I'm hoping, I mean, there will be a lot of symposia and lectures given and some amount of television coverage.
The books, there will be reprinting of your own books and of your mother's, won't there be?
I'm trying to think what the total number is. There are 3 different publishers reprinting her books. The ones that were written for a general public are all being introduced by people that will look at them in terms of their relevance to contemporary society. The ones that she did in research on contemporary cultures, she was one of the very first anthropologists to see that the tools of anthropology can be used to look at large industrialized societies as well as small, pre-literate, technologically simple societies. And those books are all coming back, and they're very relevant to what we today call cultural studies, that people in literature and history and so on are using the tools that were developed in that research. And then the classic monographs. The studies of particular pre-literate societies are being republished because they represent a record of ways of being human that we can't duplicate today because everybody's being influenced by each other.
Now, you're going to have to run through that again. Tell me what you mean by that. We can't replicate them. Why?
When my mother, as a woman in her early 20s, went to Samoa, the concept guiding anthropologists was what has been called salvage anthropology.
Salvage?
Salvage. They knew that there were communities on islands, in jungles, on mountaintops, that had evolved their distinctive ways of life over hundreds of thousands of years, that were about to be confronted with outside influences of all sorts. That was a treasury of ways of being human. Now, there's a certain kind of homogenization taking place. Just as animal and plant species are being wiped out, human languages are disappearing, customs are being forgotten, songs and dance styles and rituals, and people are in these small communities are no longer so isolated, and they're becoming integrated into a world economy which may not be kind to them.
The globalization.
That's the globalization pattern. So that these distinctive adaptations are being blurred. And what they believed in the 20s was that it was really important to get as much as you could on the record. One of the most important things, I think, that my mother did, that she deeply believed in, all of the notes of her field work are in the Library of Congress so that people will have access, not to her interpretations, they're in the published books, but to the raw material of what she was able to see. I wish I could persuade everyone else to keep their notes and make them available in that same sense.
What happens to the profession, to the science, to the field of anthropology, when, as you say, we have been eliminating the very raw materials that the anthropologist always used?
Well, what happens is that what anthropologists learned from the study of small, isolated, by no means simple, but technologically simpler groups, becomes a way of looking at the world as it is developing. a kind of sensitivity to patterns, to cultural diversity, to the adaptive value of different ways of doing things, that I think gives a very useful way of looking at our societies today. And it's also a way of being in the world. You know, I grew up in an anthropological household, sort of trained from birth to be a participant observer, to observe what was going on around me and engage with it both, and observe myself and my reactions, and try and sort out the nature of my reactions, so that there's a style of a kind of curiosity about the world, combined with a level of introspection about what you take for granted yourself, that has come out of anthropology, but seems to me a very good way to live in the contemporary world.
What then, and we just have 2 or 3 or 4 minutes left, what then is the future of anthropology? Unfair question?
No. You want it short, it's unfair. I think the divisions we make between the sciences dealing with human beings are supremely artificial and tend to generate nonsense, frankly. I hope that anthropology will remain an integrative discipline. I'm not counting on it. There are a lot of people becoming specialists on little tiny things and much too busy to talk to people who are interested in other aspects of human behavior. There are a lot of people looking for new kinds of enclaves to study, which is fine, but not seeing how much they can contribute to an understanding of what it is to be human under particular cultural circumstances. So I don't know how anthropology is going to develop. I see both trends. I often think that anthropology is one of the best undergraduate majors. Spend your 4 years as an undergraduate thinking about what it means to be human, thinking about it both very practically and very speculatively. The research that we do is going to be very different from what my mother did in the 1920s.
Regretfully?
No, that has to be the case. It has to be the case. You have to move along. There's so many, there've been very important improvements in understanding about research. It is regretful that so many cultures have been regrettable, that so many cultures have been disrupted. It's not that I would want to require that people stick with a particular inherited tradition, but I wish they had the choice more often, that they were not simply disrupted by warfare and economic trends. So that is regrettable and something to grieve about and to try and protect the human rights of all people, whatever their cultural tradition. But I look for a world in which anthropologists increasingly contribute to our capacity for self-criticism.
Well, one way to help that along is by telling our viewers where they can get information about the Mead Centennial because we're at the end of our program. What's the website?
There is a website for the Centennial. It is www.mead2001.org.
Great. I hope everyone uses it, and I want to thank you so much for joining me again today.
And I want everyone to feel free to take a piece of the Centennial and use it to advance projects that they care about that fit with Margaret Mead's vision.
Terrific. Thank you again.
Thank you.
And thanks to you in the audience. I hope you join us again next time. And if you would like a transcript of today's program, please send $4 in check or money order to the Open Mind P.O. Box 7977, FDR Station, New York, New York, 10150. Meanwhile, as another old friend used to say, good night and good luck. Continuing production of The Open Mind has been made possible by grants from the Rosalind P. Walter Foundation, the Bluestein Family Foundation, the Thomas and Teresa Malarkey Foundation, the Garfinkel Menard Foundation, the Center for Educational Outreach and Innovation at Teachers College, Columbia University, the Commonwealth Fund, and from the corporate community, Mutual of America.